Every time you picture a Viking, you probably picture the same thing. A massive guy tearing into a roasted leg of meat, drinking from a horn, not a vegetable in sight. And honestly, that image isn't completely wrong. But it's missing so much that it almost doesn't count. Because the real Viking diet is one of the strangest, most fascinating, and occasionally horrifying food stories in human history. We're talking about bread that was slowly poisoning people, meat preserved in methods that sound genuinely disgusting, and a papal decree specifically written to stop these people from eating horses. So let's actually get into it. To be clear about what this video is, this is not a general overview of Viking culture. This is specifically about what Vikings ate, drank, and how their food affected them in ways most people have never heard of. Most of what gets written about Vikings focuses on the raids and the longships, and the food gets maybe a paragraph. But the food tells you so much more about how these people actually lived day to day than any battle ever could. So we're going to go through the most surprising, well-documented, and genuinely weird facts about the Viking diet. And by the end, I promise your mental image of what a Viking's life actually looked like will be completely different. Let's start with the thing that might be the most unsettling discovery in all of Viking food history. Archaeologists who excavate Viking sites spend a lot of time sifting through ancient cesspits, which is exactly what it sounds like, preserved Viking toilets. And what they found in those cesspits changed what we know about Viking bread. Mixed in with the undigested remains of seeds from Viking grain were seeds from toxic weeds. Weeds that are genuinely poisonous to humans. These seeds had made it into the bread, either because Vikings mixed them in deliberately for some reason we don't fully understand, or because they simply couldn't separate them out from the grain during harvesting. Either way, Vikings were regularly eating bread that contained low doses of poison. And here's the part that really gets me. They may have had no idea. This wasn't a one-off contamination. The evidence shows up across multiple sites, which means this was just a normal feature of Viking bread for a significant portion of the population. You're eating your daily loaf completely unaware that it's slowly working against you. But the bread isn't even the most creative thing Vikings did with their food, because the way they preserved meat through winter is something else entirely. Salt was expensive in the Viking Age, genuinely hard to come by for most people. So Vikings developed a different method for keeping meat edible through the long Scandinavian winter. They submerged it in barrels of sour whey. Whey is the liquid left over when you make cheese, and when it ferments, it becomes highly acidic. That acidity slows down spoilage in a similar way to how pickling works. So Vikings were essentially making pickled meat, stored in barrels, sitting in this sour fermented liquid for months at a time. And this wasn't a backup plan or a desperation move. This was a staple. This was how a significant portion of Viking households got through winter. The meat that came out of those barrels would have tasted nothing like what went in. It would have been sour, dense, preserved in a way that modern people would probably find deeply weird. But it worked, and it kept people alive, which in a Scandinavian winter is the only thing that really matters. Now, before we get to the thing about the Pope, I want to make sure you actually understand how different Viking society was depending on who you were, because this matters for everything that follows. We actually have physical proof, from bones, that Vikings ate very differently based on their social class. Scientists can analyze the ratio of carbon and nitrogen isotopes locked inside human bones, and those ratios tell you, with real precision, what kind of diet someone had over their lifetime. When researchers applied this to Viking skeletons, the results were stark. Warrior class remains showed significantly higher levels of marine protein and meat consumption compared to farming communities. You can look at a Viking skeleton and tell, from the chemistry of the bone itself, whether this person was eating like a warrior or eating like a farmer. The image of all Vikings feasting on the same food is just not accurate. Your diet in Viking society was a direct reflection of your rank, and your bones remembered it long after you were gone. So what were the wealthy Vikings actually eating? This is where it gets genuinely surprising. Most people assume Viking food was plain. Boiled meat, simple stews, nothing fancy, but wealthy Vikings had access to cinnamon, pepper, ginger, cardamom, and saffron. These spices came through extensive trade networks that stretched all the way to the Islamic world along the Silk Road. Excavations of high-status Viking sites have turned up physical evidence of these spices. Not just written records, actual archaeological evidence. which means a wealthy Viking in the 9th century was seasoning their food with ingredients that had traveled thousands of miles to reach their table. The contrast with the farming class eating preserved sour meat from a barrel couldn't be more extreme. Viking society had a genuine culinary upper class, and they were eating food that most people today would recognize as sophisticated. But here's what almost everyone was eating, regardless of class. And it's something that would feel deeply alien to us today. The most common daily meal for a Viking was a stew that never fully stopped cooking. Vikings called it scouse. And the way it worked was that the pot was kept going for days at a time. You'd add ingredients as they were available, meat, root vegetables, whatever you had, and the pot was never completely emptied. It was less a recipe and more of an ongoing project. Most Vikings ate a version of the same permanent stew every single day of their lives. And the breakfast situation was equally strange to modern eyes. Vikings ate exactly 2 meals a day, one in the morning called dagmaal and one at night called natmaal. The morning meal for adults was typically last night's leftover stew, reheated over the fire. Children got porridge. There was no concept of a fresh morning meal. You ate what had survived overnight in the cauldron, and then you got on with your day. That's important context, but if you don't also know about what was living inside most Vikings at any given moment, you're missing one of the most remarkable parts of this whole picture. Cesspit analysis, again, archaeologists really earn their pay, shows that parasitic worm infections were near universal in Viking settlements. We're not talking about an occasional outbreak or a particularly unlucky community. We're talking about most Vikings, most of the time, carrying intestinal worms as a baseline condition of their existence. The worms came from living in close contact with animals and from eating undercooked meat. And the reason this is so striking is that it wasn't treated as an illness. There was no solution, no treatment, no awareness that this was something that could be fixed. You just had worms. That was the default state of being a Viking. They were functioning, farming, raiding, trading, and building ships, all while hosting a collection of parasites that nobody thought to question. Now, of all the facts in this video, the one that I genuinely couldn't believe when I first came across it involves the Pope. In 732 AD, Pope Gregory III issued a papal edict, an official church decree, specifically prohibiting the eating of horse meat. And the reason this edict was written, in large part, was because Vikings were eating horses as part of pagan religious rituals connected to Odin. The church wanted to stamp out the practice because of its religious associations. But here's the part that tells you everything about how seriously Vikings took their horse eating. When Iceland converted to Christianity in 1000 AD, they negotiated a specific exemption allowing them to continue eating horse meat. That was a condition of conversion. You can have our souls, but we're keeping the horse meat. Iceland still eats horse meat today, by the way. The exemption stuck. And speaking of things that have lasted, you've almost certainly eaten something invented by Vikings without knowing it. Skyr, the thick dairy product now sold in every Western supermarket as Icelandic yogurt, is over 1,000 years old. It was invented by Viking-age Norwegians and brought to Iceland, where it became a staple food. But here's the thing. In the Viking age, skyr wasn't eaten with a spoon. It was drunk. It was a liquid, and it was so ordinary, so associated with the lowest level of peasant food, that in one Viking saga, a character is genuinely offended when his host serves him skyr instead of ale. The equivalent today would be going to someone's house for dinner and being handed a glass of tap water. That's what skyr meant to a Viking. The fact that it now sits in a premium section of the supermarket with a price tag that would confuse any self-respecting Norse farmer is a genuinely funny historical reversal. One more thing before we wrap up, because this one changes the visual of Viking food in a way that's hard to unsee. Vikings ate carrots regularly in their stews. But Viking-era carrots were not orange. They were white or purple. The orange carrot that everyone pictures today was selectively bred in the Netherlands in the 17th century, centuries after the Viking Age ended. So when you imagine a Viking stew, the mental image needs adjusting. Pale white carrots, dark dense bread, gray preserved meat that came out of a sour whey barrel. It looked nothing like what we'd picture. It was a completely different palette of food, from a world that was operating with completely different constraints, completely different knowledge, and a completely different relationship to what eating actually meant. If you've made it this far and found any of this as genuinely interesting as I do, Drop a comment with the fact that surprised you most. I'm curious whether it's the poisoned bread, the horse meat exemption, or the worms that gets people. My bet is the worms. And if you want more videos like this, deep dives into the parts of history that most people skip over, subscribing actually helps more than most people realize because it tells the algorithm this is the kind of content worth showing people. There's also a related video right here that goes into a similarly overlooked corner of history that I think you'll enjoy just as much. So let's quickly recap what we actually covered. Viking bread was potentially poisoning people through contaminated grain. Meat was preserved by submerging it in fermented sour whey for months. The Pope wrote an actual law to stop Vikings eating horses, and Iceland negotiated to keep doing it anyway. Breakfast was cold, leftover stew. Skyr was peasant food you drank. Warrior bones and farmer bones had measurably different diets. Wealthy Vikings were cooking with Silk Road spices. The permanent stew pot never fully emptied. Intestinal worms were just a fact of life. And the carrots were white. The version of Viking life that most people carry around in their heads is missing almost all of this. And the thing is, the real version is so much more interesting than the myth. These were people solving genuinely hard problems. How do you feed a family through a Scandinavian winter with no refrigeration and expensive salt? How do you preserve enough food to survive? What do you do when you have no solution for the worms? The answers they came up with were creative, practical, and sometimes deeply strange. And that's what makes it worth knowing.